Anyone who drives an old car knows how much work it takes to keep it on the road. But even the most intrepid home mechanic can get tripped up by one big hurdle: emissions testing. In America, there are 28 states plus the District of Columbia where some form of emissions testing is mandated for used cars. The rules vary for which cars need to be tested, which are exempt, and how often it's required, but the result is the same. If a car fails, even if it's otherwise running just fine, it can't be registered. Unless you know a guy.
Let's just say I know a guy who knows a guy who knows another guy.
If you live in one of those states, you know how hard it can be to source parts and fix whatever issue caused your car to fail. On top of that, the equipment shops use to test older cars is also getting harder and more expensive for them to maintain. Frankly, it's all a mess. So it was big news earlier this year when California, of all places, home of the most restrictive emission standards in the land, began debating some common sense changes that would make smog testing cheaper, easier, and less of a minefield for classic car owners. The bill had big backers, including SEMA and Jay Leno himself. It seemed like a sure thing. Months later, it was dead. And the story of why that happened is a lesson in how broken our state-by-state patchwork of emissions laws has become, why it's so hard to change them, and what the car community needs to do to actually win the next big battle.
It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No!
On March 4th earlier this year, a California Republican senator from Bakersfield introduced legislation for what became known as the Leno Law. At the time, the only gas vehicles exempt from smog testing in California were vehicles from 1975 and older. That is less than 1% of all vehicles with California plates. The bill's purpose, according to the senator and Leno, was simple: to exempt classic collector cars from the, quote, unnecessary and burdensome smog check. If you've only ever driven cars that have never known a world before the movie Avatar, smog has never really been a problem for you. Just a $200 fee. But for older cars, it is not that easy. Cars from 2008 to present day have it the easiest. The technician plugs into the OBD2 port, checks that there are no codes, verifies the emission control monitors are ready, and gives it a visual inspection to top it off. A very computerized process that is reported directly to the DMV for registration. Now, the OBD2 system was actually introduced in 1996, but the codes weren't standardized until, you guessed it, 2008. So cars from 1996 to 2008 have manufacturer-specific codes that are readable as long as the smog tech is referencing the right manufacturer. OBD2 implies the existence of OBD1, and that's what cars had before 1996. These cars require more equipment to test, such as a dynamometer, aka the giant rollers you see on the floor at the smog shop, and a sniffer, which reads the chemical composition of exhaust gases. But at least OBD1 still gives some form of digital data. Cars that predate 1991 don't even have that. All the data needs to be gathered manually. So most states use a rolling model year cutoff for requiring emissions testing. So once a car hits 25 years old, or whatever that number is, it's exempt from all of this. Or states like Maryland set a fixed cutoff at the OBD1, OBD2 transition in 1995 to avoid requiring smog shops to keep all this physical equipment for older cars. But California set its fixed cutoff at 1975, meaning there's over 20 years worth of vehicles that have to be tested the old-fashioned way. Take it from me, the guy with a 1988 K5 Blazer that just failed its smog test. Lots of shops don't even have that gear anymore, or can't maintain it because the companies that made it don't even exist today, and they'll just say, sorry, we can't test that. Cars that predate OBD2 only make up 4% of registered vehicles nationwide. And even if they're polluting more than new cars, in no way are they the cause of dirty air anymore. And if that 4% did not require smog checks, then tons of smog shops could save money by no longer having to maintain their old units. And this would obviously benefit the owner as well. The emission standards are based on what the vehicle was capable of when it was new, and a 30-year-old Mercedes with 300,000 miles on it should be praised for just running at all today, not told it can't be registered because it's burning some oil. There are plenty of things that can cause an older vehicle to fail a smog inspection. Carbon deposits, vacuum leaks, dirty air filters may be easy to fix, but oil blow-by and clogged catalytic converters are much more expensive. And sometimes the market doesn't really even have an OEM equivalent anymore to serve as a direct replacement. It's one thing to keep something running, but to get it compliant, it needs to match OEM spec as closely as possible. Basically, the older the car, the harder it's going to be for it to meet smog standards.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I love the young people.
That's why states like Florida, Michigan, and Arizona have relaxed rules for classics, or mileage-based exemptions like Illinois if you drive less than 5,000 miles a year. California stands alone in its strict rules, while also having more cars on the road than any other state in the country, which is why the Leno Law would have had such a huge impact. The real hypocrisy of this is that the emissions regulations in California aren't actually focused on the overall amount of emissions. They're just strict. For example, if you swap an engine from a newer car into an 80s chassis without emissions controls, it doesn't matter if that combo actually pollutes less than the original. It still needs the complete emission system exactly as it came on the donor car as sold in California to pass the required inspection. So we're not testing emissions as much as we are compliance. The California Air Resource Board even directly prohibits the conversion of vehicles that need smog testing to run on alternative fuels. So Toyota's hydrogen-burning AE86 testbed from 2 years ago wouldn't even be allowed on California roads, even though it's a zero-emissions vehicle. I know it's not very likely for anyone watching to do a hydrogen combustion conversion in your garage, but it shows that the real problem isn't emissions, it's bureaucracy.
You are technically correct. The best kind of correct.
Individual owners are also nowhere near as likely to be abusing loopholes as big corporations are. If you really wanted to close loopholes, you would change the EPA's emission standards that vary based on vehicle weight, because that is a big part of the reason vehicles have been getting heavier and bigger in the US, to take advantage of the less strict emissions standard. So Jay Leno, the Crimson Chin himself, set out to tackle this problem. His bill focused on classic cars because A, that's what he's most passionate about, and B, most vehicles on the road that are over 30 years old are owned by enthusiasts anyway. He and other classic car enthusiasts argued that these cars are rolling history, and since they're rarely driven, they should be exempt from the smog checks. I like the idea that just because something is old, we should let it have a pass. Kind of like we do with grandparents when they say problematic things at Thanksgiving.
Grandma, you can't talk like that, okay? It's not right.
The plan was also meant to be a symbolic gesture in a way, as many supporters called it, quote, a measure to preserve automotive history. They felt exempting the classic cars acknowledged their cultural value and importance in a state already so rich and steeped in car culture. The bill and its supporters advocated for a 35-year rolling exemption to keep the law consistent and fair. So every year, another batch of cars would be grandfathered in. The Acura NSX, BMW E36, and the Lamborghini Diablo could all technically be classic cars free from testing as of this year. But let's talk in a language these politicians always seem to care about the most, and that's money.
Any money in it?
SEMA, or the Specialty Equipment Market Association, was a big proponent of the bill. You may know it as the group behind the huge trade show in Vegas every year, but it's also one of the most powerful lobbying groups advocating for aftermarket parts producers and businesses tied to car culture. SEMA argued that the bill was an important step in helping small businesses and classic car owners alike. The logic being, the more older cars people can keep on the road, the more money that gets spent to maintain them in the long term, and the more jobs that are preserved. Plus, it argued that the number of classic cars on the road is so small compared to daily drivers that the impact on emissions was negligible to non-existent. But perhaps the most interesting positive of this whole proposal was the fact that support from collectors and enthusiasts meant that they wanted to follow the laws in the first place. I mean, I know people who allegedly got their 80s cars smogged just by taping a $100 bill to the intake. We already have drivers leaving hundos and tailpipes or registering cars to the Desolation of Smog LLC in Eureka, Montana.
You shall not pass!
Then the data is already skewed as it is. So SEMA and supporters continued to push for the simplicity of a rolling exemption on cars 35 years and older. Other industries, like movies, TV, video games, have seen that when the path to do something legally is made easier, less people do it illegally. Movie piracy dropped significantly when services like Netflix and Hulu launched. Now, it's steadily rising again as prices and availability make those services less convenient. As you can imagine, Leno's Law was met with some opposition, and not just because of concerns about increased pollution. No, opponents of the bill argued that ultimately the change would still end up costing the state more money. The Assembly Appropriations Committee said that the DMV and the Bureau of Automotive Repair would need new systems that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Plus, the California Air Resources Board estimated that it would cost about $1.2 million to add new employees to gather data on the environmental impact as well as update their own systems. And we all know how good the DMV systems are right now. These critics were also worried that people would take advantage of the law and start driving collector cars daily, as though smog is the only reason I don't drive my Blazer daily. They got that covered with how expensive gas is out here. The very term daily comes from the fact that while we love our old cool cars, we often want something a little more practical for day-to-day use. But legislators didn't see it that way, and it became one of the biggest sticking points of the bill. What supporters saw as easy to understand, critics saw as easy to circumvent. So changes were proposed to make the bill more amenable to its opponents. Like for starters, amendments were introduced that would require collectors to have special collector car insurance policies to qualify, which was intended to prove that the car wasn't a daily driver. But then, the owners had to also apply for historical vehicle license plates that would come with their own usage restrictions, as well as a robust paper trail to further track compliance with the law. Not a problem for a guy like Leno, but certainly already less of an everyman's bill. The final amendment also delayed the updated law's implementation to 2027 in order to give the necessary state departments time to update and implement their systems. So instead of giving enthusiasts a break and eliminating emission standards for 4% of vehicles on the road, half of which were probably already hot smogged anyway, the bill now only applied to museums on wheels. Cars that were almost exclusively owned by the type of people that could afford to get them smog compliant in the first place. Ultimately, the problem with SB 712 was that it tried to serve too many masters. Groups like SEMA and other car enthusiasts were, well, less than enthused by these new amendments that they felt neutered the bill and made it no longer meaningful. It overcomplicated things, and it wouldn't even benefit them for 2 more years. As outside support fell away, legislators didn't see much upside either, nor did they want the political risk. In a state that prides itself on climate policy, going against the grain could be a massive political liability. I mean, the last thing politicians wanted is news reports saying, lawmakers compromise clean air so Jay Leno can drive his smoke-belching AMC Eagle. SB 712 ended up becoming a bill so unpopular, not even Leno's star power could make a difference. In the end, it got filed away in the bureaucratic equivalent of a farm upstate.
No, Mama.
They never even bothered with a public vote. And that was that. So how do we get the smog laws changed, and not just in California, but the whole country? Well, we need to show people who don't care about cars that there's more benefit to be had and almost no actual risk. It would also help to have more hard data. Supporters argued that the emissions were already negligible, but to push a new bill further down the road, we're going to have to show some concrete evidence. Crunch the numbers on how often enthusiasts drive their cars to begin with. Explain to lawmakers that maintaining these vehicles is hard enough already and is only done by people who are passionate and want to see their communities thrive. Work with groups like the California Air Resources Board and even health groups to provide input on the bill instead of just criticism. There could also be an exemption built around actual emissions output and mileage driven. So for example, a higher emissions vehicle could be registered if it's driven for less miles annually, similar to what Illinois does already. And the Leno Law also had an imaging issue. Honestly, it did have more of a feeling of giving rich hobbyists a pass than it did preserving history. So clearer rules, harder data, shared buy-in, and better branding. These 4 things seem simple enough. But it's clear that legislators need more than a tour of Jay Leno's garage. They need a roadmap to tell them exactly where to go and why. It's odd that California lawmakers have no problem noting the historic impact of decades-old hot dog stands, but not the car that drove you there. But there is hope and precedent for government agencies supporting enthusiasts. The FAA, for example, recently introduced the Mosaic rule for sport pilots. This removed flight limits, opened up the hobby to more versatile aircraft, including those with 4 seats, reduced the paperwork required in logbooks, and opened up the possibility of night flying. None of that was available to sport pilots before, and if classic car enthusiasts can be seen in the same way as a group looking to better themselves and enjoy a hobby, then maybe there's hope.
Reason will prevail!
Oh, yeah.
But as long as we're getting lumped in with the same people that steal Infinities for takeovers and sideshows, it's gonna be a real uphill battle. Let us know if you've been affected by how smog laws are enforced in your state, or if it's getting impossible to find the right parts. If you got a story like that, drop it in the comments. And as always, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.